Hello and welcome back to Era 7 of the AP US History curriculum. We are continuing our look at the 1920s, which was a time of tremendous change in the US. In this video, we are looking at topic 7.8, which is a focus on the cultural and political controversies that arose during the decade. There are two themes that connect to this topic. The first, a continuation of migration and settlement, and the second, a look at national and regional culture. So let's get to it. In our continuing discussion of patterns of migration, there is an important demographic shift that takes place during this decade. At the time of the first census in 1790, only about 5% of the population lived in urban areas. By the outbreak of the Civil War, that number had risen to almost 20%. By 1900, it was still just under 40% of the population, but the 1920 census revealed for the first time that a majority of the population, 51.2%, lived in urban areas. There was still a significant regional difference in urbanization. The Northeast was over 75% urban, but the South was still only 28% urban. The people living and moving into the cities were drawn there by the availability of factory jobs, even though the pay was low and the work was often dangerous. For many, especially immigrants and African Americans moving out of the South, the pay and standard of living was still an improvement over their previous situations. With the rise of large corporations, there was an increase in the need for clerical workers, and this gave employment opportunities to women to become typists or secretaries, alongside the traditional nursing and teaching occupations. By the end of the decade, more than 25% of women were employed outside of the home, and the number of married women remaining employed continued to rise. It was still very common, though, for women to be paid a fraction of what men were, even if they were working at the same location and doing the exact same job. As I mentioned in an earlier video, due to the demands of wartime production, numerous Americans relocated to urban areas where employment opportunities were abundant, creating a significant internal migration trend. This trend was particularly notable for African Americans, beginning what is known as the Great Migration. The initial phase, spanning roughly from 1915 to 1930, saw the movement of approximately 1.6 million people from predominantly rural southern areas to industrial cities in the north. African Americans from the eastern coastal regions of the South typically migrated to cities such as Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or New York. Meanwhile, individuals from the Middle South, including Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Kentucky, gravitated towards Chicago, Detroit, and other industrial cities in the Midwest, where automotive and related industries began hiring African American workers. Those from Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas tended to head to locations like St. Louis and even all the way to California. Later, a second Great Migration unfolded after the Great Depression and through World War II, drawing millions more to cities in the North and the West. As we started to see in an earlier video, the number of immigrants to the U.S. had risen tremendously in the early years of the 20th century, before being severely restricted in the early 20s. The restrictions, though, only applied to those not from the Western Hemisphere. Many were fleeing an economic depression or warfare, but when they arrived, they still faced intense discrimination. Members of the KKK and other groups attacked Mexican refugees and laborers, killing thousands. Many were hated because they were hired as scabs during strike, and many labor unions, including the AFL, refused membership to those of Mexican descent. Once the immigrant restrictions went into effect, Mexican laborers were able to find work in the automobile factories in Detroit, the meat plants of Chicago and Kansas City, or in the farming valleys of the border states, especially in the Imperial Valley of California, where they worked in the cotton fields. As we already know, the majority of immigrants had been arriving primarily from Europe, with Germany, Ireland, England supplying most through the 1880s. But by the 1890s, new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe had begun to be the dominant numbers of new arrivals, with the vast majority arriving to New York City. As a result, xenophobia was on the rise, especially during and immediately after World War I. Isolationists began nativist campaigns to restrict new arrivals and to favor those of Northern and Western Europe, since many nativists were dissatisfied that many of the new immigrants did not adhere to the Protestant faith, as Poles and Italians were predominantly Catholics, plus you also had significant numbers of Eastern European Jews. In 1917, the U.S. Congress enacted the first widely restrictive immigration law. The law required a literacy test that required immigrants to demonstrate basic reading comprehension in any language. It also increased the tax paid by new immigrants upon arrival, and even allowed immigration officials more control over whom to exclude. Finally, the act excluded anyone born in a geographically defined Asiatic barred zone, except for Japanese and Filipinos. But of course, Japan had already limited the number of people it allowed to travel to the U.S. based on a 1907 agreement with then-President Theodore Roosevelt. And the Philippines, well, they were actually a U.S. territory since they had been acquired in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War in 1898. Congress expanded on the nativist sentiment in the early 1920s and began the implementation of immigration quotas, initially the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, and then later the National Origins Act of 1924 established these specific quotas, setting very low limits for accepting new immigrants, especially those from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. These quotas were determined based on a small percentage of the number of immigrants who were present in the U.S. already by 1910 and then by 1890, respectively. Those limits, again, did not apply to Western Hemisphere nations. In addition, the 1920s witnessed an even broader expansion of the Ku Klux Klan, a second version. This one was explicitly nativist, anti-Catholic, and anti-Jewish. Their influence extended well beyond the old Confederacy, reaching its peak in the upper Midwest, at least until internal corruption issues led to their decline in the mid-1920s. The phenomenon of migration would play a pivotal role in creating new forms of art and literature that express the diverse ethnic and regional identities present in the U.S. This cultural shift laid the groundwork for significant movements. But first, it is essential to understand the broader context of the artistic and literary landscape of the decade, which was deeply rooted in and driven by modernism. Modernism embodied the belief that progress necessitated a departure from traditional forms of thought and artistic expression. And so one of the results of this was the Art Deco movement. Art Deco was seen in both art and architecture and represent a change from the ornate and intricate designs of the past. A notable examples, the Chrysler Building in New York City and City Hall in Los Angeles. This movement emphasized geometric curves and shapes, minimizing hard edges and rough textures. It became synonymous with luxury and glamour, and it resonated with the economic expansion and opulence which was characteristic of the decade. In the area of visual arts, artists like Edward Hopper captured the essence of urban life. His masterpiece, called Nighthawks, portrayed a man and a woman seated inside a diner at night, offering a poignant perspective from the streets. The painting reflects this modernist trend to depict an urban experience, showing the isolation and introspection prevalent in this time period. As a significant number of the Black population settled in New York during that first phase of the Great Migration, particularly in Harlem, a remarkable cultural and intellectual phenomenon unfolded, known as the Harlem Renaissance. This was a vibrant revival of the arts and intellectual pursuits within the Black community, which had a tremendous impact across various forms of artistic expression. Jazz, one of the quintessential American art forms, found its birthplace in the hands of musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. Armstrong, often called the father of jazz, was especially noted for his trumpet playing and distinctive vocal style. He was also known for improvisation, and his unique approach to melody and rhythm resonated with audiences far beyond Harlem. Armstrong's influence extended even beyond his musical contributions. He became a cultural icon, breaking racial barriers and paving the way for future generations of African American musicians. Duke Ellington was a prolific composer, band leader, and piano player. His approach to jazz was more like an orchestra, characterized by intricate arrangements and innovative compositions, which influenced a broader landscape of American music. Their contributions, along with many others, not only shaped the cultural landscape of Harlem, but also left a mark on the global music scene, since jazz music would be one of the major influences on early rock and roll. The Harlem Renaissance also had a profound impact on literature. Writers like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay emerged as literary pioneers during the Harlem Renaissance, using their words to illustrate the Black experience in America. Through poetry, novels, and essays, they explored the complexities of identity, discrimination, and resilience. Langston Hughes, often called the poet laureate of Harlem, was a central figure in this literary scene. Through his poetry, he captured the rhythm and spirit of Black life in America. His works, like The Negro Speaks of Rivers and The Weary Blues, explored themes of heritage, identity, and the collective consciousness of the Black community. His verses also kind of followed the cadence of jazz and blues, which created a distinct poetic style that mirrored the cultural changes of the era. Claude McKay, another influential voice, contributed both poetry and prose. His poem, If We Must Die, became a rallying cry against racial violence and oppression, embodying a spirit of resistance and defiance. His novel, Home to Harlem, explored the lives of African Americans in the urban landscape, especially trying to show the complexities of creating an identity in the quest for belonging. His writings were particularly infused with social commentary. The literary works of Hughes and McKay and their contemporaries ultimately provided a way to show the complex experiences of African Americans and address issues like discrimination, racial prejudice, and the quest for equality. Harlem Renaissance literature challenged stereotypes and provided a platform for diverse voices to contribute to a national conversation on race and identity. It also helped to foster a sense of pride and cultural awareness within the African American community, and to garner a wider recognition for the artistic contributions of Black writers. Simultaneously, another group of writers, dubbed the Lost Generation by Gertrude Stein, who herself was an integral part of this group, rose to prominence during this era. Figures like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway were central to this literary movement. They were deeply affected by the disillusionments arising from the sacrifices and devastation of the war, resulting in a loss of optimism and hope for progress in society. Lost Generation writers' works delved into the growing materialism in American culture and grappled with the profound societal impact and the squandering of life and resources that had occurred during World War I. Themes of disillusionment and a challenge of societal norms were common. Many chose to create their works while residing abroad, especially in Paris, which was motivated by the city's looser moral restrictions and a significantly lower cost of living. Despite residing that far away, though, their publishing houses were here in the U.S., symbolizing a global interconnectedness, despite the growing isolationism that was taking over U.S. politics. Among the noteworthy figures of the Lost Generation, you have Ernest Hemingway, who's one of the most well-known. He served as an ambulance driver in Italy during World War I and was wounded while going back and forth to the front lines. These experiences fueled his seminal work, A Farewell to Arms, which serves as a profound allegory focusing on the futility of war and emphasizing the inevitable consequences of death and destruction that follows in war's wake. Another influential figure was F. Scott Fitzgerald. While widely recognized for The Great Gatsby, his most celebrated work during his lifetime was This Side of Paradise. This work deeply connected with readers of the 1920s, echoing the feelings of a generation dealing with the aftermath of war. Other figures in the movement included Theodore Dreiser, author of An American Tragedy, and Sinclair Lewis, who wrote Main Street and Babbitt. William Faulkner represented a Southern influence, and he also emerged as an important figure in the 1920s. His masterpieces included The Sound and the Fury and As I Lay Dying, which demonstrated an exploration of Southern culture in a distinctive narrative style. Not limited to novelists, this lost generation also produced influential poets like T.S. Eliot, Robert Frost, and E.E. Cummings. Overall, this literary movement reflected the broader cultural shifts and challenges faced by a generation affected by the war and seeking new ways to share their experiences. Also in the 1920s, a significant political and cultural clash arose between modernism, science, and traditional values. The controversy began in 1924 in Tennessee, which had passed a law prohibiting the teaching of theories conflicting with the biblical account of divine creation. The ACLU sought a challenge, prompting a call for a teacher to defy the law. High school biology teacher John Scopes agreed and was indicted for teaching about evolution. The trial gained massive public attention, featuring prominent figures like Clarence Darrow as Scopes' defense attorney, and William Jennings Bryan, a noted Presbyterian fundamentalist and former presidential candidate, serving as the prosecutor. John Scopes was ultimately found guilty and fined $100. The trial, though, had a lasting impact, leading to a gradual acceptance of teaching of evolution in classrooms nationwide, though it wasn't actually legal in some places until the 1960s. The bigger picture was that it seemed like it was fundamentalism itself that was really on trial. And this clash between modernism and traditional values, as seen in the media sensationalism surrounding the Scopes monkey trial, as they called it, was driven by a perception in small towns in rural America that rapid progress in consumerism of the 1920s was threatening American culture and values. Radicalism as a cultural controversy also became more pronounced in the infamous Sacco and Vanzetti trial in 1921. Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti found themselves charged and convicted of a double murder during a robbery in South Braintree, Massachusetts. The trial drew attention as the judge and jury seemed to be predisposed against them, considering factors such as the fact that they were from Italy, that they were atheists and anarchists and had not served in the war. The prosecution specifically emphasized these elements, portraying the defendants as radicals, and they were ultimately convicted after just a few hours of deliberation and sentenced to death. A series of appeals followed based on recanted testimony and conflicting evidence, and a rather prejudicial pretrial statement by a member of the jury, plus a confession by someone else. Despite those pleas, all appeals were denied, and they were executed in 1927. The case garnered international outrage, leading to riots in cities across the globe following their execution. What made the situation even more contentious was the perceived class bias, as those who condemned them were part of the upper class, while they were part of the working class. So this brought up more debates around the intersection of justice and radicalism and societal privilege. And finally, there's also the challenges to societal norms. In addition to there being increasing opportunities for working women outside of the home that we've already talked about, women were a major challenger of societal norms, especially in what they wore and how they looked. The iconic figure of this decade is the flapper, who embraced short hairstyles, wore looser-fitting dresses with higher hemlines, adorned themselves with glamorous long jewelry, and adopted an attitude that life was short and could end at any moment. They were seen as brash for wearing excessive makeup, drinking alcohol, smoking cigarettes in public, driving automobiles, and even possibly treating sex in a casual manner, which basically meant they were flouting social and societal norms. At the same time, or perhaps even because of this new carefree attitude, there was actually a significant uptick in the use of contraception amongst women. Advocates like Margaret Sanger championed the cause for women to have fewer children or to delay childbearing, which would give women a chance for more time for career development, giving them greater independence and enabling them to pursue things like education and professional work. Margaret Sanger's contribution included the founding of the American Birth Control League, which later became Planned Parenthood, dedicated to giving information on contraception to women so as to prevent the so-called back alley abortion, since abortion was illegal in the United States at the time. She felt that the only practical way to avoid abortion was to make contraception easily available. She was arrested and prosecuted for her beliefs and activities numerous times, and remained active in the movement until her death in the 1960s. The contraception debate eventually grew into a much broader and more complex issue of abortion that continues to present day. Well, that covers what you need to know about Topic 7.8, Cultural and Political Controversies in the 1920s. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.